Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The U.S. government partially shut down for a record number of 35 days and has now reopened. By signing a short-term spending bill, Trump has bought time till February 15th to negotiate with Democrats over border security. This about-face by the U.S. president has angered conservatives who are advocating for a U.S.-Mexico border wall. The efficacy of such a structure is still up for debate. To discuss all those issues a bit further, we're joined now by Dr. Gina Yannitell Reinhardt, who is a political economist, joining us from Essex. She's associate professor and senior lecturer at the Department of Government at the University of Essex. And we're also joined by Dr. Georg Lofflmann, who is a researcher, and he is with the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. Thank you both for joining us and for taking your time out to speak with us here in the Scope. Dr. Gina, if I may, I'd like to start with you. What are your thoughts about Trump's seemingly about-face, at least, when it comes to the shutdown? Certainly there was a lot of pressure on him, wasn't there?
Absolutely. The pressure was just getting stronger and stronger. The fact is that operating the government in a shutdown phase, this partial shutdown, is really, really difficult and incredibly expensive. And as each day passed, more and more people were being affected by it. And Congress dug their heels in and would not allow the funding for the wall. Technically, the House of Representatives is in charge of the budget. So this is one of the few things that Democrats have control over right now. The seeming about face is a little complicated. It's a short-term extension, and that means that he may decide to shut it down again. But it certainly looks as though Congress doesn't want to give in.
Indeed, and you know, Dr. George, I'm wondering if all this was worth it for Donald Trump. Do you think it was?
Well, so much in politics is about perception, right? And I think the perception here for Trump is really disastrous because he has always built himself as the deal maker, the one who would, bend Washington to his will and his whim, if you will. And now he's actually walking away with absolutely nothing. He has no confirmation that his wall is being built. The majority of Americans blame him for the government shutdown, not the Democrats, not the House of Representatives. And I think this nimbus of Donald Trump has really taken a severe hit here. And I think there's also reports in the White House that Trump was quite conscious of the fact that there is a massive negative backlash. And I think at the approval ratings, he is now a president that has the lowest approval rating after a halfway term for the last 7 decades. So I think it's really a disaster all around for Trump.
But Dr. George, to be fair, if I may, doesn't it seem like the Democrats have conceded a bit as well in regards to border security and immigration? Because we do now have Pelosi also talking about being a bit tougher on illegal immigration, saying that possibly Democrats can, while they will not support a wall, as Trump understands that they would support additional money for technology and increased patrols. That is the Democrats also taking a step forward towards Trump, isn't it?
Absolutely, but Trump could have already gotten that before this government shutdown, right? This was completely unnecessary. There was already a deal on the table for increased funds for border security, sensors, a so-called smart wall. All of this Trump could have had without throwing this temper tantrum. In fact, this was really red meat for his diehard base of nationalist voters, the ilk of Ann Coulter and other commentators. But the strategic mistake I think that Trump is making is that he is not governing for the majority of Americans. He's only governing for a very narrow base of Republican voters, right? And so I think now we have seen the backlash from the rest of America against this very narrow and divisive politics.
Dr. Gina, do you think that's right, though? Because at the end of the day, it is that base that got Trump into office, isn't it? So, I mean, if the likes of Ann Coulter are now calling Donald Trump a wimp, as you may have seen in her tweet about this decision of Trump to sign this short-term spending bill, do you think that Trump may have made a mistake here by giving in?
He may have, but whether or not he did is still debatable. The fact is that up until now, really nothing sticks to Trump in terms of his core support base. And whatever he tells them is whatever they're going to believe. So if he makes the argument that he did his best and that it's the fault of the Democrats and it's the fault of the House and the fault of weak Republicans, his support base will believe him. There are definitely people like Ann Coulter who have changed their opinion on Trump and about Trump many, many times. And it's likely that he will get his core supporters behind him no matter what he does.
Okay, so if I may now, Dr. George, I wanted to go to the issue of the wall itself, because that seems to be the root cause here, isn't it? Illegal immigration, the wall, asylum seekers, we can name it a number of things, can't we? But Donald Trump came into office promising this wall. He is seemingly, of course, wanting to deliver on that. He's even willing to, as he has threatened, declare a state of emergency, if necessary, specifically in that regard, to get the military involved in building it. Do you think it's worth all of this trouble, to build this wall at this time, and will it even be effective?
Well, I think there's like separate issues here, right? Okay. So for the one thing, there's this very highly symbolic issue of the wall, and it is sort of one of the cornerstones of Trump's sort of populist rhetoric and discourse of anti-migration, protectionism, nationalism, right? And then there is immigration as a policy issue, for Trump, even a national security issue. And there we have, multiple analyses that a wall in on itself is actually doing nothing to address the issues of illegal immigration into the United States, and that we actually have seen, a decrease in certain illegal border crossings. So I think what Trump will try to do at some point is to declare victory in some form, right? So if we will see something like a smart wall, right, an installment of border sensors, more border patrol guards, that sort of thing, I think as my colleague here also said, Trump will then say, I've fought and I've won and I've gotten everything that's possible, and now we have a wall of some sort in place.
Okay, let me add another voice to this conversation. We're now by Ambassador Salman Bashir, who is a former ambassador. He's joining us from Islamabad. He's a former foreign secretary as well. Ambassador Bashir, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Ambassador, what do you make of this entire issue of the border wall? The government, being shut down, partially shut down, that is, for 35 days, may very well happen again in about a month's time if Trump doesn't get his way.
A difficult question, because basically, as I see it, Trump has been acting on his pre-election promises. He is playing to his popular base, where he thinks he has the support. And this was one of the things of building the wall, as you know, was a promise, an election thing. And he has been consistent in sort of seeking funding from the Congress. Now, that is the case. Of course, this was the longest shutdown in the U.S. government for a long time. And I think essentially, as I see it, the president has his eyes on the 2020 elections. And for him, the priority is to fulfill what he deems appeals to his popular base.
Dr. George, tell us, when we're talking about specifically Trump campaigning for 2020, do you think that he is doing that through this insistence on this wall? And secondly, do you think that going forward that his base will stand by him in those 2020 elections?
Well, I think what you see with Trump is a story that his overall approval ratings are quite low, but that his diehard supporters have never broken with him. And whatever scandals have come out, with the Russia investigation, and I also think now with this budgetary shutdown, Trump's climb down, I very much believe that his diehard base of supporters, and I think 90% of Republican voters are sort of with Trump. But the problem is he's losing the independence, right? And he's losing sort of like the middle America. What I think Trump will do in running for re-election is he will very much run on his America first message, right?
Let me go to Ambassador Bashir, if I may. Ambassador Bashir, do you think that when Trump says America first, many people take that as a negative, motto for the U.S. president to be taking on. But isn't that just logical? I imagine, as his supporters would argue, why not put America first as the U.S. president?
Well, I think basically I personally sort of understand from where Trump is coming, and he has been consistent on his views. Even decades ago, he had his own worldview. He had his own vision of the United States. I think he has been pretty consistent. Now, of course, in that sense, he is unconventional. So, of course, we've seen that, the turnaround in his own cabinet, people sort of joining him and leaving. And with all the investigations now and the mainstream media against him, but he has been pretty consistent. He is an unconventional president who, of course, I think is logical. I agree that America first is something which is very logical. He definitely has a vision, and he wants to do things differently. And that is what makes him hugely consequential, I think, not only for the U.S. and the world. Because even in his worldview, I think his instincts are basically maybe okay.
So Ambassador Bashir, I wonder, when we're talking about the amounts of money that would go into building a wall, and as you well know, of course, Trump as candidate had promised that Mexico would pay for the wall. We know that will not, of course, be happening at this point. We're talking about $5.7 billion, which Trump wants for this wall. Democrats obviously refusing that amount. Do you think that he'll ever really be able to deliver on something that expensive?
No, of course, the whole issue is a domestic political issue for him. But even if you look at his overall global approach, his decision to withdraw from Syria, and there are indications that Trump, the president, wants to sort of at least have a partial withdrawal of forces, U.S. forces from Afghanistan, all sort of suggest the same thing. That is, America comes first. Even if you look at what has happened between the U.S. and the NATO alliance, he has been pretty consistent that America comes first, and I think nobody should sort of object to that. But it is altogether another question, the way he goes about it. So we are in unconventional times, and this is, I think, a president of a very important country, the only superpower, which matters for the global order, and we see all that order shaking now just because of America first. So I think the world has to gradually adjust to the new situation.
Dr. George, I wonder what you feel about that. Do you think that America First is a healthy motto? It seems logical, of course, as I put to the ambassador, for an American president to want to put his own country first. Why has that, do you think, rattled so many of us outside the country?
Well, I think sometimes we tend to think America and Trump in isolation, but I see America first and the rise of Trump part of a larger story of the rise of populism in the West. We see this in Poland, we see this in Hungary under the Orban government, who has talked about building an illiberal democracy. We have seen this in the Brexit Leave campaign. And it is really a momentum for politicians and movements that are claiming that the liberal international order and a dominant set of economic neoliberalism, globalization, have essentially betrayed the interests of ordinary voters, right? So the set that is meeting currently at the Davos Economic Summit, and a lot of these populist movements are both mobilizing fear and anxiety about immigrants, about foreigners, about economic competition. Your manufacturing jobs are being outsourced. They're closing down factories in Michigan and they're reopening them in China. And so Trump has very successfully tapped into these fears and anxieties, and he continues to, I think, mobilize this discourse. And if you look at the composition of the Electoral College and, the voter base in those, key states like Wisconsin, like Michigan, that, swung the vote for Trump, then the Democrats will need to not mobilize these fears and anxieties, but they have to take them seriously. And they have to acknowledge the fact that globalization has not benefited all voters equally, that there are, fears and anxieties about white America and about the changing demographics in the country, turning into a minority-majority society. So, Trump is part of a story of populism. I think it's a global story that, is not.
Okay,
it's not
let me pick up on that point that you just made there. Do you think that this populist wave that we're seeing in the Western world is understandable, that there is this concern about changing demographics in these spaces?
Yes, I think, of course, that Trump being a symptom of, or a symbol of populism, a wave of populism that has swept the better part of Western Hemisphere is quite clear. I mean, of course, that is true. But then the other question basically is, if you go into analyzing all that, what can one realistically do? Globalization is a fact of life. It has always been there. And can globalization be reversed? To my mind, that is something that is just not doable, because it has, over these previous few decades, changed the very structure of the global economy. Now, globalization was premised on free flow of capital, of goods, the services sector, which has also sort of moved out according to economic advantages. And then, of course, the question of changing demographics. That is something which is in the order of nature, and there's hardly anything one can do about it, except to build walls in every nation state. So I think we are witnessing a phenomena in international affairs, which is in a way, it sort of smacks of a certain regression in civilizational terms. But I don't think this is going to work. So I think as far as the U.S. is concerned, the U.S. has been an open society for all these years.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether this trade war with China or, reversing globalization is at all possible. I think basically adopting geopolitical means to prevent all this is probably not going to work.
Very well. I'm going to ask all of our guests to stay with us. We're going to go into a very short break. Viewers will be back with more about this U.S. government shutdown. Now, of course, it has ended with a short-term spending bill. We'll continue discussing this. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us, viewers. We're currently still joined by Ambassador Salman Bashir as well as Dr. Georg Lofflmann. Thank you both for staying with us. Dr. Georg, if I may, I'd like to continue with you and ask you, when we're talking about this issue of immigration, when we're talking specifically about illegal immigration for the United States, a lot of those people that come over the border, especially the Mexico border, of course, are spoken of in very negative terms. But isn't it a fact that they have contributed a lot, though, to the United States as well? Why isn't that, do you think, spoken of more?
No, of course. When you look at Trump's, announcement speech, where he, referred to Mexicans as murderers and rapists and drug dealers, you have absolutely a dehumanizing language that is being used here by Trump to denigrate, migrants, illegal migrants. He has made derogatory remarks about African countries. So there is really a streak of a very strong streak of xenophobia and nativism in Trump's language, something that kind of like echoes sort of like the Know Nothing Party of the 19th century. And when you look at the statistics, then, for example, crime rates among immigrants, among illegal immigrants, are actually lower than the native-born American population. Immigrants are an absolute vital sector in the U.S. economy, in agriculture alone. Just for example, in California. But again, immigration is being used as a policy issue to mobilize voters, in particular, less educated, non-college educated voters, lower income voters, that are feeling threatened by these arrivals, because there is a squeeze, especially in lower income sections, right? Again, like a similar debate we're actually having here in the United Kingdom about Brexit and EU migrants, right? And are EU migrants especially competing with British people for their jobs, and now Brexit as a reaction, leaving the European Union to put a stop on free movement, putting up barriers. So it's part of the same story. But I think when you look at the economics, that by and large migration is beneficial to both the United States and the United Kingdom, and you have a plethora of statistics coming out. But the perception for certain segments of voters is that it is a threat, and politicians like Trump use this and actually echo and reinforce this perception of threat for their own political gain.
Indeed, and Ambassador Bashir, that's a point that I wanted to, that when we're talking about these immigrants, be they illegal or be they have come in through legal means, these people have contributed, vitally, haven't they, to Western societies? They've helped, with all the way from the most menial of jobs to research in vital fields in the West, and have joined world-class universities, etc. All of this is very important for progress in the West, is it not?
No, absolutely, I agree. I think one of the key reasons that the U.S. has prospered and has really been at the top is that they allowed people and they welcome people, qualified, talented people from all over the world to come to the United States and work and contribute to research and development and technology. So that itself has been a phenomenon. And I think it is sad to see this fear, the xenophobia, phobic, tendencies, and this thing. I think, I personally think that maybe if one sort of tries to philosophize a little bit about it, it appears to me to be a sort of a cultural backlash to globalization, because certain segments feel threatened by globalization. It is something akin to conservative societies. Take Afghanistan, of course, for instance. Which is a very conservative society, which is again bent on sort of preserving its way of life, and they have been threatened by globalization. So I think this is perhaps something like that. Maybe I'm wrong, but as far as the question of the contribution of qualified people having opportunities to work in the U.S., that has been a source of strength, perpetual strength for the United States.
Okay.
And as far as the loss of jobs and other things, it's not just an economic issue, because those jobs cannot be recreated. The economics have changed. Manufacturing has moved out, mostly to other shores. And this has happened globally. I think, for instance, shipbuilding was and textiles were the prime industries in Britain, in Denmark. They all moved out to Japan, to Korea, and then to China. So I think it's not just the economics of it, because now with this AI, the new technologies, which are sort of, in any case, based on having autonomous systems and robots and all that. So that cannot be recreated. So if it is just fair, if I can put it bluntly, the preservation of the species, now that's another theme altogether. But Trump has said that if, we want to save America as we know it now, that is the vision of United States being an Anglo-Saxon white society. Well, that is a different thing, and that is the sort of thing that is appealed, that has a popular appeal in certain quarters. It doesn't have widespread appeal in the United States. But on the other hand, I think the opposition, that is the Democrats, of course, they have the House now, but they have not been able to come up with some narrative which will sort of, ease concerns even of those who are of the populist type.
Okay, so Dr. George, I wanted to get your final thoughts, if I may. Do you think that the United States and other such societies can preserve, as Ambassador Bashir put, their Anglo-Saxon nature, the majority white population, etc., however we want to term it? Can they preserve that? Is that a good thing? Will they regret this? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you have essentially a battle here between two different political visions, right? One is sort of this nostalgic vision of making America great again, right? Harking back to some idealized sort of like 1950s style past of a white patriarchal hegemony, if you will. And, that's absolutely under challenge. And if you see the media attention that the Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is getting, right? She's, if you will, the face of a future vision for the United States, multiracial, inclusive. And increasingly you have the Democratic Party being associated with that version of the United States and that liberal, multi-ethnic, multicultural America, and the Republican Party being increasingly identified with a white nationalist vision of America. And I think that if you look at the demographics and the changing demographics in the country, this liberal multicultural vision will win out. But it is absolutely an ideological battle over setting the cultural and political hegemony of the country. And again, this battle is going on in many European countries as well, where you have the liberal cooperative vision of the European Union being challenged by national and nationalisms here. So, but ultimately, I'm hopeful that the nationalism will win out in the end.
Yeah. Okay, we'll leave that as our final word. Of course, we appreciate all of our guests and the analysis and insight that they've brought into this discussion. From the top, I'd like to thank Ambassador Salman Bashir, who's a former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador, speaking to us from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Earlier in the program, we were joined by Dr. Gina Yannitell Reinhardt, political economist, speaking to us from Essex. And we were joined there at the end by Dr. Georg Lofflmann, researcher, who was speaking to us from Coventry in the United Kingdom. Viewers, of course, as all of our guests there spoke about, this U.S. government shutdown is all about, or was all about at least, now it has ended, at least temporarily for another month or so. It was all about Trump, giving through on his campaign promise about this border wall between the United States and Mexico to stem the flow of illegal immigration, and in Trump's vision and his supporters' vision, the crime that occurs because of that, though the numbers do not necessarily support that point of view. We'll wait and see how this all plays out. Will Democrats give in? Who will give in further? It seems, though, that Trump has been the first one to blink. As I said, we'll keep a close eye on that here in The Scope. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Thank you for staying with us here in The Scope, ladies and gentlemen. In this segment, we're going to discuss Italian officials who have strongly criticized France over migration. They say it is France's contemporary colonialist policies towards Africa that have encouraged people to flee, seeking asylum in Europe. Italy also says France needs to do more regarding migration in Europe by accepting more refugees. France has so far refused to respond in kind, only summoning the Italian ambassador to register its protest. To discuss all related issues to this, we're joined now by Max Civili, who is a journalist based in Rome. He's Press TV's correspondent in the Italian capital. We're also joined by Alexis Poulin, who is a journalist based in the French capital. He's also the co-founder of Le Monde Moderne Media. Thank you both for joining us. Max, I'll start with you. There's, of course, a lot to get through, isn't there, Max, when it comes to Italian officials and their criticism of France. Do you think that a lot of that is just for public show, or do you think Italians actually agree with what their officials are saying?
Look, Waqar, relations between Italy and France have historically been bittersweet. I'd say more bitter rather than sweet. Frictions date back to the Roman Empire some 2,000 years ago, when Rome was trying to win more territories across Europe and was very much involved in a number of wars against the fierce French Gauls for centuries. And many years later, before Italy's unification in 1861, the French ruled with an iron fist for decades in central and southern Italy, in the so-called Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. But also in more recent time, Italy's energy giant Eni was secretly financing the Algerian independence movement against colonialist France in the Algerian War in the 1950s. So although the two countries undoubtedly share an immense cultural heritage, relations between Italy and France have always been somehow complicated. And the recent frictions between Italy and France are not just limited to migration, which is just the tip of the iceberg, but there are other serious political issues at stake here. And tensions between Rome and Paris have been simply exacerbated since the change of governments in Italy last June, when the so-called populists took power in Rome. That's when Macron's view of society and political issues and the Five-Star Movement League government started to be in conflict, to say the least.
So, Alexis, I wonder what your point of view is from Paris, because Macron, in fact, called movements like the Five-Star Movement, I believe, a leprosy in Europe. That's quite a strong, harsh statement. Are these two very opposing ideologies for Europe, do you think? And do you think that's really what comes to the heart of the disagreement between these two governments?
I don't think they disagree. Both Cinque Stelle and the Liga, the political parties for Salvini and Di Maio, don't want to leave Europe. They are very critical about Europe because of the non-existent solidarity between member states. And it has been an ongoing issue that is very visible with the migration crisis. But if you look at policy in France for migration, it's pretty much alike to what Matteo Salvini wants to put in Italy. It's a strong border control. It's not accepting further migrants. And it's being very tough on the migrants who have not the right to stay in those countries. So it's all for the show, I would say, because the European elections are coming up. And of course, there is something that Emmanuel Macron wants to pretend to be this openness, European international guy compared to nationalists who are supposed to be evil. But if you look at the policy in details, it's pretty much converging towards the border control and a tough stance on migration. So I think what was more at the beginning of the brawl was the fact that Salvini supported the Yellow Vest movement in France, saying that they were right to try to overtake Emmanuel Macron. Yeah. And I think that was the red line when you have a European partner trying to promote civil war to some extent in a neighboring European country.
I'm glad you brought that up, Alexis, because Max, that was a bit of a confusing statement, wasn't it, coming out of Italy? Why would an Italian official or Italian officials support the Yellow Vest protests in France? As Alexis there said, a fellow European country doing that? That's a bit odd, isn't it?
Well, it is odd, but it is understandable politically. Di Maio is trying to win support even abroad. He even offered the Yellow Vest the Five-Star Movement's website to actually support their campaign. Let's say that France, it didn't take much for France to react. I remember Nathalie Loiseau, the Minister for European Government, saying to Di Maio to basically to mind his own business. But let's say that there are definitely similarities between the Yellow Vest movement and those who support the Five-Star movement. The thing is that here in Italy, that discontent was channeled in this political movement that has also managed to actually win the election in 2018, last year. In France, we didn't have such a movement. We still have the classical divide between the Mélenchon's leftist movement, and then we got the right wing with Marine Le Pen. So I would say that at this stage, the Five-Star movement should be deemed as a resource here in Italy, as a way to channel discontent.
That's an interesting point, isn't it, Alexis? Because if we're looking, and I know you alluded to this already in your first response there, if we're looking at the numbers just of support, Alexis, I was reading a number today, I believe, where a poll was carried out in Italy, and the government there right now, or these officials right now, have around 60% support, I believe. I would imagine Macron's numbers are much lower. I didn't read a recent poll, but he's just been going through these Yellow Vest protests. I imagine he's not done extremely well in those recent polls. That goes to show where the people support is, isn't it? And that's worrying for Europe, isn't it?
It's true that with the Five-Star movement, there was a receptacle for the trouble and the people not being happy with classical politicians. But it was all done to one man, Beppe Grillo, who actually toured Italy and managed to bring people together. The Yellow Vest is very different because it's people in their own region starting the movement very separately with very different people. The fact that you have, we live in democracies, and the fact that the people in power actually represent a party and a majority of the population should be the normal way. Of course, it might be questionable that some nationalist stance or even some xenophobic program managed to get this majority. But it's a fact. And the problem we have is that so far we have to reinvent our modern democracies because, especially in France, we have the vote system that doesn't allow smaller parties to get in power. There is a sort of a glass ceiling where it's impossible within the system to break through. And this is where the anger comes from, that politicians actually don't represent the real people, the real French people. And I think Italy managed, but it's a very different political system because of the election, because of the parliamentary system there. In France, we have a presidential system, and that's why it's very different from one country to the other.
Okay, let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Van Meguerditchian, who is a journalist and political commentator, and he is joining us also from the French capital, Paris. Van, as always, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Van, one of the issues that has come up, of course, and the main issue, seemingly at least, between this row between Italy and France is that over-migration, asylum seekers specifically. And, of course, we've had Italian officials talking about France's colonialist past as well as its present policies when it comes to Africa. Do you think that that's a legitimate criticism to make when it comes to France's policies?
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a good question, but the problem with this is that the question comes after some type of a conflict between France and Italy over the wrong issue. The issue of the migrant crisis was supposed to unite, bring Italy and France closer to each other instead of dividing them. Well, the question should be why this divide and not unity over this issue. France and Italy were suffering, had this challenge facing them at the same time in the Mediterranean. The problem here was that France and Italy had to address this challenge together and put it in the European Union and find a solution for it. Instead, they are divided because the French President Macron decided that instead of bringing France closer to Italy, he decided that he should be taking a stance against the new Italian government before actually seeing what the Italian government was supposed to do. And here lies the problem. Why did the French president decide to start a problem instead of using this issue to unite two countries and bring his position to a leadership level in Europe?
Okay, gentlemen, we're just going to take a very quick break. We'll be back continuing the discussion about this Italy-France row and all the related issues. Stay with us, viewers. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, as we continue to discuss this row between Italy and France over migration and other such issues. We're, of course, still joined by Van Meguerditchian, journalist and political commentator, speaking to us from Paris. We're also going to add another voice now to this conversation. We're joined with Mr. Sandew Hira, who is the director of the Institute for Scientific Research. He's coordinator of the Decolonial International Network, and IISR is an institute for research into decolonizing the mind. Thank you for joining us, Sandew, in the scope. I wonder what you make, Sandew, of the whole issue of this accusation that Italian officials have made towards France, saying that it's colonialist attitude, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, in Africa that has led to this issue of asylum seekers on its shores. What do you make of that?
It's a bit laughable because Italy itself is a former colonial power. The government of Italy is a right-wing government, which is in those certain ways anti-colonial. It uses the colonial card in a problem they have with France regarding the arrest of left-wing former people who were accused of terrorism, apprehended in France and to be delivered to France, and they use any argument that is possible. So there's nothing anti-colonial in it because they are themselves very colonial in their whole attitude towards immigrants. They see immigrants as inferior people. They don't want them there. They have racist narratives about immigrants. So there's nothing anti-colonial in that narrative.
Interesting, Van. I wonder what you make of that point of view, because say, Van, that this entire accusation of colonialism was laughable, as Sandew there said, considering, of course, Italy as well is a colonial power, or has been, at least in the past.
I understand France and Italy, in a certain way, they have a similar past regarding the issue of colonialism, but Italy not so much as France. But the point here is the present moment. The present moment when the Italian politicians, the Italian government, Italian ministers talk about this French colonialist behavior, what they want to say really is the way France is treating its southern neighbors in the European Union, the way France is approaching every political challenge in the European Union. What they want to say is that Italy is not Greece. Actually, the way the French government, the way certain European Union members have been treating Greece during the Greek debt crisis a few years ago, the Italians want to say we will not be bullied, we will not be bullied, and we will not work under pressure and adopt policies that the French government would like us to adopt. We are not Greece. We are Italy. We will deal with this in a different way. We have the popular support. We have the Italian voters supporting us in our decisions. So this is the argument between Italy and France at the moment.
Sandew, I'm going to give you the final word then for this topic, because whether or not the intentions of the Italians were to do it or not, they did bring up, though, didn't they, a legitimate point to talk about these countries' policies abroad beyond Europe's borders and the effect that has elsewhere in the world. We can name Africa, of course, as the Italian officials did. Do you think that's a fair point to bring up in this conversation when we talk about asylum seekers and that wave of migration to Europe?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is definitely true that France is a colonial power, but the use of progressive language by right-wing forces to justify racist policies in Italy to deter the influx of immigrants there is just not a correct thing to do. Because if you want to attack French colonial colonialism, well, link it to the colonial reaction of Italy to immigrants in Italy itself, the racist treatment of immigrants. That would be the correct way to link Italy's narrative to French colonial narrative. Definitely, France is a colonial power, is abusing its power, is still exploiting people in Africa, engaged in staging coup d'etats in Africa. That's all true, you know. And it's true that there is a sentiment against the European domination of Spain, Italy, UK, you name it. But the use of those sentiments by right-wing forces with progressive language shouldn't be supported, in my view.
Very interesting. Okay, we'll leave there at that. Our final comment, but of course, I'm sure this issue will remain long-standing. We'll be discussing this for the days to come. I'd like to thank all of our guests. Let me start from the top there. We're joined there by Mr. Sandew Hira, Director of the Institute for Scientific Research based in The Hague. We were joined earlier by Alexis Poulin, journalist based in the French capital, Paris. We're also joined by Max Civili, journalist based in Rome. And we were joined by Meguerditchian, journalist and political commentator, speaking to us from Paris as well. Now, viewers, of course, this issue of Italy, France, and the row that they've been having over migration, specifically, of course, starting from Italian officials, criticism of how France treats migrants, saying that France is the one, in fact, responsible for creating these migrants in the first place because of its colonialist policies in Africa. Whether or not that's a sound argument or a hypocritical argument, I should say, coming from a colonial power itself like Italy is, of course, an argument to be had, as we've had in this discussion. Keep a close eye on that and other such European affairs here in The Scope. But thanks for watching for this edition. I've been Waqar Rizvi.